He is called the Superman of Asia, a man who built cities, moved markets, and shaped economies. Yet every morning Ka-shing walks into his office in the same modest suit, wearing a plastic watch, worth less than a meal. He sits at a plain wooden desk, pours his own tea, and begins another day, quietly, deliberately, as if wealth were a burden he must carry with grace. This is the paradox of Ka-shing. The richer he became, the simpler he lived. He controls ports that touch half the world's trade owns, power grids, towers, and telecoms. Yet he speaks of impermanence, quotes Buddhist sutras and bows before life, as if it cannot be owned. In an age when billionaires flaunt jets and yachts, he preaches humility. In a world chasing attention, he cultivates stillness. He once said, "The more you possess, the more you must let go." To his employees, he is Boss Lee. To his rivals, a legend. To himself, merely a student of time. For he knows that power, like fortune, is fleeting, and that the true measure of a man is not how high he rises, but how lightly he walks once he's there. He was born in war, built in poverty, and tempered by patience. Every decision, every risk, every triumph executed not for greed, but for control of the self. So who is Ka-shing really? A businessman, a philosopher, a monk disguised as a magnate. He built one of the largest empires in Asia, and yet his greatest empire was over his own desires. Because for Ka-shing, wealth is not power, discipline is. Before the skyscrapers, the speeches, and the reverence, there was a boy from Chaozhou, barefoot, hungry, and afraid. Ka-shing was born in 1928 in a small riverside town of southern China during an era when the country was torn between warlords and invasions. His father, a schoolteacher, taught him Confucian virtues, honesty, diligence, humility. But when tuberculosis took his father's life, those virtues became all he had left. At 13, Lee buried his childhood. His family fled to Hong Kong to escape the Japanese occupation. The city was crowded, restless, and cruel to the poor. He dropped out of school and went to work in a watch strap factory. 16 hours a day, his small hands shaped plastic, his back bent under fluorescent lights, his mind absorbing everything. While other boys dreamt of rest, he studied business terms from discarded newspapers and memorized the habits of his supervisors. He once said, "When you have no capital, your capital is time." Each night, he would walk home through the alleyways, the smell of oil and smoke clinging to his clothes. He'd eat a bowl of rice, read whatever he could find, and plan. Not dreams, plans. Because for Ka-shing, hope without action was fantasy. By his late teens, he had become a factory foreman, quiet, precise, reliable. He never wasted a movement or a word. When his boss spoke, he listened twice, once to the words and once to the silence between them. He learned the difference between ambition and arrogance. One builds patiently, the other destroys quickly. In 1947, at 19, he lost his job. The company collapsed during Hong Kong's post-war crisis. He was left with nothing but his mother, his younger brother, and a promise to never depend on luck again. He took temporary work, saved every coin, and waited. Waiting, that became his art. He saved enough to rent a small warehouse where he started making plastic flowers. Hong Kong was rebuilding and demand for cheap exports was rising. Most saw the business as trivial, but Lee saw pattern and potential. He studied European catalogs, observed materials, and understood something others missed: quality could make the humble extraordinary. In 1950, at the age of 22, he founded Chung Kong Plastics, naming it after the Yangtze River, long, enduring, unstoppable. His first employees were his family and a few laborers who trusted his quiet conviction. The days were long, the margins thin, but Lee worked as if guided by something sacred. Every mistake became data, every success a formula. He wasn't gambling on fortune, he was rehearsing discipline. He had learned to see time not as an enemy, but as an ally, a partner that rewards patience and punishes pride. In an era of chaos, he built stability from sweat. In a city ruled by wealth, he built wealth through restraint. He never forgot hunger. He never forgot the fear of losing it all. That fear didn't control him, it refined him. By the time others noticed the quiet young man in the corner, he was already years ahead, planning his next move, not toward comfort, but toward control. Because for Li Ka-shing, survival was not the absence of struggle. It was the mastery of it. In 1950, at the age of 22, Li Ka-shing stood inside a small rented factory on the edge of Hong Kong. The walls were thin, the machines secondhand, and the smell of plastic hung in the air. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't safe. But it was his. With borrowed money and a name inspired by the river that never stopped flowing in Cheung Kong, the Yangtze, he began his life's work. At first he made plastic toys, buckets and cheap goods for the local market. But the profits were small, the competition fierce. Li realized quickly that to survive, he couldn't compete on volume. He had to compete on vision. So when he saw that European buyers were importing artificial flowers, he noticed something other amiss. They looked cheap. He thought, if I can make something better, they'll come to me. So he studied the craft, the color of real petals, the texture of silk, the way light hit a leaf. He retooled his factory by hand, experimenting with molds and dyes, until the flowers looked almost real. The first shipment went to America. It sold out instantly. Within a year, Cheung Kong Plastics was exporting to the world. From that point on, every success followed the same pattern: observe, prove, execute. Li never chased trends. He dissected them. He wasn't emotional about business. He treated it like meditation, a discipline of constant refinement. He once said, "The key to success is simple. Work harder than anyone else and think longer than anyone else." His reputation grew. Buyers respected his honesty. Employees admired his fairness. Even competitors feared his patience. When others celebrated short-term profit, Li reinvested every cent back into his company. He didn't buy cars or houses. He bought machines. He bought time. By the late 1950s, Cheung Kong was one of Hong Kong's largest plastic manufacturers. But for Li, plastic was never the destination. It was the foundation, a lesson in building something from nothing. He had mastered production. Now, he wanted permanence. He began to notice something outside his factory walls land. Hong Kong's population was exploding, but political tensions made foreign investors nervous. Property values fell. Where others saw risk, Li saw rhythm, the same cycle he had seen in business. Chaos, fear, opportunity. He began quietly buying small parcels of land with every spare dollar. No one noticed. He was still just the plastic flower man. But in his mind, the real business had already shifted. He once told a young colleague, "Money comes and goes, land stays." He watched as British tycoons fled uncertainty and Chinese merchants hoarded cash. Li kept building. Every piece of land he bought was a prayer to the future, a belief that Hong Kong, like him, would rise again. And when it did, he would be ready. By the early 1960s, he was no longer just a manufacturer. He was a strategist, a man who had transformed a factory into a vision. His empire didn't begin with buildings. It began with flowers made of plastic, crafted by patience, sold with integrity. Because for Li Ka-shing, greatness wasn't built from luxury. It was built from labor, refined, disciplined, and repeated until it became destiny. By the late 1960s, Hong Kong was a city on edge. Riots filled the streets, factories shut down, and property prices collapsed. For most businessmen, it was a time to hide, to preserve, to wait for calm. But Li Ka-shing had lived through war, hunger, and loss. Fear no longer impressed him. To him, chaos was not danger. It was signal. While others hoarded cash or fled to safer shores, Li quietly began buying land, small plots first, then entire blocks. The newspapers called it madness. The British elites whispered that the plastic flower man was gambling above his weight. But Li wasn't gambling. He was calculating. He understood something most did not: time moves in cycles, not lines. The very moment everyone runs away is the moment destiny begins to change direction. He once said, "Crisis creates wealth for those who can keep calm." When the unrest subsided, Hong Kong awoke to a new skyline, and much of it belonged to Li Ka-shing. The properties he had bought for pennies were suddenly worth fortunes. But even then, he didn't flaunt his success. He reinvested quietly, expanding his company Cheung Kong Holdings into a real estate empire. His approach was pure discipline. No speculation, no ego, just timing, patience, and arithmetic. He learned every law, every zoning rule, every flaw in the system, and used precision as his weapon. While others chased fast profit, he designed permanence. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 1979, with Hong Kong still under British control, the colonial power decided to sell off parts of Hutchison Whampoa, one of the oldest British conglomerates in Asia. It was a symbol of Empire Port's shipping utilities legacy. No Chinese businessman had ever dared to buy it. Li Ka-shing saw history opening its door. He negotiated relentlessly built partnerships, and when the chance came, he took it. In 1985, he became the first Chinese entrepreneur to acquire Hutchison Whampoa, and with it, control of Hong Kong's largest port and shipping operations. Overnight, the world saw a headline: "It never expected a Chinese buys the British crown jewel." It wasn't just a business victory, it was symbolic. For generations, Hong Kong's economy had been ruled by British capital. Li had just reversed that hierarchy, not with protest or politics, but with logic. He didn't boast. He didn't celebrate. When reporters asked how it felt to conquer the symbol of colonial power, he replied softly, "I didn't buy it to prove anything. I bought it because it made sense." And that was Li Ka-shing, emotionless in triumph, measured in movement, dangerous in stillness. He expanded beyond Hong Kong, investing in Canada, the UK, and Europe. Every decision followed the same rule: buy when others hesitate, build when others retreat, and hold when others panic. His empire was no longer made of plastic or flowers. It was made of ports, towers, and pipelines. But the same philosophy pulsed beneath it, and all discipline over desire, logic over luck. He had turned patience into a weapon, and timing into an art. While others chased waves, Li Ka-shing learned to move with the tide, not as a surfer, but as the ocean itself. By the 1980s, Li Ka-shing was no longer just a Hong Kong tycoon. He was a global force, a man whose handshake could shift markets, whose silence could move governments. Yet despite the vastness of his empire, he still arrived at work before dawn, sat at the same desk, and wore the same $50 watch he'd owned for decades. To him, luxury was distraction. Precision was power. His company, Chung Kong Holdings, now controlled vast real estate across Hong Kong and mainland China, while Hutchison Whampoa grew into one of the world's largest conglomerates, ports, energy, retail, and telecommunications. His reach stretched from Asia to Europe, from shipping docks in Rotterdam to mobile networks in the UK. But what held it all together was not expansion, it was logic. Li Ka-shing never chased scale for its own sake. Every move was reasoned, patient, and deliberate. He believed wealth was like water, too much flow without structure, and it destroys everything it touches. So he built systems, not empires. Frameworks, not monuments. He once said, "I am not in the business of taking chances. I am in the business of minimizing regret." Inside the offices of Chung Kong Center, there was no glamour, no marble floors or golden decor, just simplicity and focus. He ate the same lunch every day, rice, vegetables, and soup. He read 3 newspapers before sunrise and studied global trends long before the internet made such foresight easy. His discipline wasn't a habit. It was his armor. When he made mistakes, he admitted them immediately. When markets overheated, he sold early. When fear gripped the streets, he bought quietly. Employees said he had an almost supernatural sense of timing, but it wasn't intuition. It was pattern recognition, built through decades of observation. He treated his businesses like living organisms: ports, energy, telecoms, real estate. Each part of a single ecosystem. If one weakened, another strengthened. He called it balance through diversity. At the heart of it all was trust. Li Ka-shing valued reputation more than return. He paid suppliers on time, rewarded loyalty, and treated mistakes as lessons. To him, integrity wasn't a virtue. It was a strategy. In meetings, he rarely raised his voice. He listened more than he spoke. But when he did speak, every word landed like a verdict. Employees described the silence before his answers as more powerful than the answers themselves. He built an empire where fear of waste replaced fear of failure. No gold pens, no first-class tickets. Even senior executives shared the same modest habits. It wasn't frugality, it was philosophy. He once told a young entrepreneur, "Money is only useful when it flows like blood. When it stops, you're dead." Through this discipline, his empire grew without collapse, surviving every crisis from oil shocks to financial meltdowns. While other billionaires rose and fell, Li remained immovable, balanced, precise. He didn't just control assets, he controlled motion. He didn't just command people, he commanded trust. And through that trust, Li Ka-shing transformed capitalism into something deeper. Not a game of greed, but a meditation on order. Because for him, business was never about possession. It was about alignment between wealth, wisdom, and will. By the time the world called him Superman, Li Ka-shing was already thinking about impermanence. He had seen too many empires crumble under their own weight, too many tycoons blinded by pride. So, while others celebrated their power, he prepared for its ending. In 1997, as the Asian financial crisis tore through markets, billionaires watched their fortunes evaporate overnight. Hong Kong's property prices fell by half. Investors panicked. Li did not. He sat in his office, calm, quiet, studying numbers like a monk studying scripture. While others sold in fear, he bought ports, energy assets, infrastructure, all at a fraction of their value. He once said, "Panic is the most expensive commodity in the world. I never buy it." By the time the market recovered, he had doubled his wealth and expanded his global reach. When the 2008 global crash hit, he did it again. Every downturn became his classroom, every recovery, his reward. To him, crisis was not chaos, it was clarity. But as his empire grew beyond imagination, Li's focus turned inward. He began to withdraw from daily control, spending more time reading Buddhist texts and philosophy. His mornings started before sunrise meditation, then newspapers, then meetings. His desk was spotless, his handwriting deliberate, his manner unchanged. Employees said he carried the calm of someone who had already beaten the game. He told his sons, "I built a business, so you would have the freedom to build meaning." In 2018, at the age of 89, he announced his retirement. No drama, no farewell speech, just quiet gratitude. He handed the reins to his son Victor Li and smiled faintly as the cameras flashed. "I've worked all my life," he said softly, "and now I will enjoy the sunrise." But even in retirement, he never truly stopped building. Through the Li Ka-shing Foundation, he redirected billions into education, healthcare, and innovation. Universities in Hong Kong, Chaozhou, and Canada bear his name not as monuments but as seeds. Money, he said, is a tool for doing good. If it only serves you, it imprisons you. He gave away half his fortune, quietly funding hospitals and scholarships across Asia. To him, charity was not generosity, it was duty. At an age when most men chase legacy, Li Ka-shing chased balance between wisdom and wealth, between faith and ambition, between gain and letting go. He had spent a lifetime mastering time. Now, he was mastering peace. Because the true measure of success, he said, is not how much you own, but how much you can give without fear. And as the markets continued to rise and fall, Li Ka-shing, calm, precise, unshaken, stood apart. A sage in a suit, a monk among magnates, a man who learned how to win by learning how to yield. In the quiet years that followed his retirement, Li Ka-shing became something larger than a businessman. He became an idea, the embodiment of what wealth could mean when guided by wisdom. The skyscrapers still bore his name. The ports still carried his ships, but the man himself lived simply in the same modest home, eating the same humble meals, reading until late under a single lamp. He had spent his life mastering business. Now, he was mastering detachment. Reporters often asked about his secret. He always smiled and said, "Patience, integrity, and compassion." Those three words had built his empire, and now they were the pillars of his legacy. His foundation became his final creation, not built from concrete or steel, but from conscience. Through the Li Ka-shing Foundation, he poured billions into education, science, and medical care. He funded hospitals in Hong Kong, research in Canada, and scholarships across Asia. Every donation came with the same quiet intention: to give people the chance. He never had the chance to rise through effort, not luck. He said, "I once lived on the edge of hunger. I know how much a door of opportunity can change a life." Yet what set him apart was not the scale of his giving, but the humility behind it. He refused ceremonies, avoided titles, and shunned the vanity of philanthropy. His favorite saying came from Confucius: "The benevolent man is invincible." He lived by it, believing that kindness, when disciplined, was the highest form of power. In his later years, he spent hours reflecting on the balance between material and moral wealth. He spoke less about markets and more about meaning. Business, he said, is like breathing. You inhale profit, you exhale compassion. Without both, you die. And perhaps that is why long after his retirement, people still called him Superman. Not because he conquered markets, but because he never let them conquer him. He turned ambition into humility, discipline into generosity, and success into service. He proved that wealth, when guided by wisdom, could heal rather than divide. That true power was not measured in billions, but in the ability to remain kind in a world that rewards cruelty. His legacy is not the empire he built, but the example he left. That greatness without goodness is hollow, and money without mercy is meaningless. In a century defined by greed, Ka-shing lived as its contradiction, a billionaire who prayed before profit, who built faster than most but walked slower than all. He didn't just build an empire, he built balance. He didn't just chase fortune, he cultivated virtue. And when history remembers him, it won't be for how much he owned, but for how gently he held it. Because Ka-shing understood what few ever do, that the highest form of wealth is the freedom to give it away.